It's a theme that I've worked on over the last 10 or 15 years, how countries learn from one another, or fail to learn from one another. Things that they really need to learn, but often don't. Having read some of the papers, not quite all of them, because I haven't mastered Google's stream, but the papers I have read, there seems to be a history of failure reported in most of the papers that countries haven't learned from other countries, particularly in Europe. The one success story seems to be bicycles in Moscow, but we haven't come back to that one later. Mine is actually a discussion of relative success stories in the Faludi way. Success meaning things that actually transfer from one country to another. I'm not going beyond that necessarily. Sorry, how do I change? Right. The South, broadly Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I hate the term Australia and New Zealand. I believe in the South, but not in the South, if you see what I mean. But I use this term for convenience. Poor countries, that's what I'm talking about. And for centuries, there was a one-way transfer of knowledge from Europe, the United States, to the South. Much of this was due to colonial rule. British colonies accepted ideas from Britain, Dutch colonies from the Netherlands, French expertise, and this was very common. So generally, travellers during that period were very common. With independence, governments gained more control over their own policy choice, but most innovations continued to come from the north. And almost nothing ever emerged from the south, at least in urban innovations. Nothing came from Latin Africa or Asia that was imported into Europe or the United States. One or two examples of the transfers, architectural tastes. In Colombia and Bogota, you can see areas of English-style architecture. They make films about London using shots based in Bogota. Then there's the California-style architecture, and the same is very common in Rio. You've got urban suburbs with commercial malls and supermarkets, all with foreign names. So architectural tastes changed. Master plans were imported almost wholesale into the south. They weren't all that effective in Britain, but they were even less effective in most parts of the south. New cities, less common because of their expense, but imitations of middle teams were common in Latin America. Brand new cities, usually with consultants from developed countries, Abuja in Nigeria, Brasilia. Although Brazilian architects, there was a strong influence from abroad. Ciudad Guayana, a whole lifting of architectural and consulting experience from MIT and Harvard. Whole teams went down and they all wrote books about it, so we know perfectly well their influence on the city. And more recently, shopping malls, fast food restaurants, gated communities, CCTV cameras, ubiquitous in most parts of the South. Why the one-way flow? Well, occasionally it was forced, as in IMF conditionality agreements, the World Bank, the Inter-American Bank, the Asian Development Bank, all had their protocols or insisted certain things to be introduced. But in general, most transfers were either corrupted. The Chinas, the Nigerias, the Argentinas, the Brazils said they would do one thing to the World Bank and then do it. So there was a lot of flexibility, and the things on the ground not accepted. The transfers were encouraged by what have been called epistemic communities. I hate fancy words like that, but these are groups of people, usually people trained in the north, in universities like Delft or UCL or Texas or MIT, who then go home and with their newfound knowledge trying to apply that knowledge to their outcome. Sometimes validly, sometimes to make money. Northern techniques generally had more prestige at a higher status than anything local, which meant that, for example, if the traditional design of housing used wood, then that was displaced by cement, because cement was modern. Modernisation meant imported stuff from the most modern countries in the north. And the role of universities, I think, in this is absolutely key. Whatever was outlawed during PhD studies or master's studies, when the student was doing it, was an attempted transfer to the south. Then there were also the commercial interests. Why did medicine spread so rapidly? Well, because the Spanish and French commercial interests were trying very hard to sell their expertise in port cities. Consultants, both local and international, were key in this transfer or attempted transfer of knowledge. So the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank often had a package which was transferred from, I was finding it very funny, Washington, which can't run its housing, can't run its government, can't run anything, is the centre of learning for most of the third world, seemingly. This is an irony beyond all ironies. So, and that's where the multilateral development banks come. Many of these new innovations were dangerous and unfortunate. Many failed completely to take account of the needs of the poor. Master plans just forgot the poor. They just tried to exclude from the formal planning areas. Brasilia was a wonderful case in point, even though it was designed by Brazilians. The central area, the Planalto, was beautifully laid out in modern design for cars and motorways and so on. And where did the poor live? Well, beyond the Planalto, miles away in typical shanty towns found in every city. So this is crazy. And globalization is, I think, it's hastened the process because third world cities are increasingly competing in the global economy. And in the process of competition, they're beginning to try and become like first world cities. They want skyscrapers, they're shopping malls, they want gated communities. They are imitating the good and the bad of US cities. If it were Dutch cities, we're trying to imitate it, we'd be much happier. But US cities, oh heavens, please no. Of course, there have long been signs of opposition to this worldwide transfer. Gandhi in India was a source of sensible or not sensible opposition to modernisation. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, was an argument for doing something different. Ivan Illich, Tools for Conviviality, sort of intermediate technology thinking, more reliance on local expertise and so on. For a while, China, as a man, walking on two legs, was an antidote to Western thinking, and again, rightly or wrongly, was imitating in certain parts of the world. Tanzania, maybe Cuba, but there was some influence from China. I'm arguing that urban innovations from the south are relatively new, but are occurring. But of course, course, innovations from the South in a broader context are particularly new. The bungalow, the English bungalow, I don't think you have bungalows, it's just so much in the Netherlands. In England, the bungalow spread one-storey houses, and this was an invitation taken by colonial traders from India back to Britain. That's about, maybe you can suggest some other innovations. That's the only urban innovation I can think of that preceded, say, 1950. But dance from Latin America and song. Europeans and North Americans are perfectly happy to accept music and dance, even if they're not willing to learn anything else from America. The European taste for Asian cooking, hastened by, of course, the migration process, but here Indonesian, in Britain, Chinese, in France, Vietnamese cooking spread in Britain. But until 1980, there was very little in the way of urban innovations. Define urban how perhaps comment over that later. Among the innovations that I would argue have spread from the South to other parts of the South, or even sometimes North, are self-help housing titling programs. The idea that if you give a title, housing to squatter dwellers, they will suddenly miraculously get access to credit, they will be able to register their businesses, the nonsense that Prof and the sort of petals. There's some sense in these ideas, but it's vastly exaggerated benefits. Participatory budgeting, particularly Brazilian origins, from Porto Alegre. These have actually spread into Europe. Micro-lending from Bangladesh, Rami Bank, has spread in popularity across the world. And the two I want to talk about in this talk are bus rapid transport systems, BRT. We started in Curitiba and spread to Bogotá, and then it spread very extensively. I'll give you details later. And the capital housing subsidy programs that developed in Chile and have spread at least throughout Latin America, if not beyond. BRT systems. Now, before the Dutch here get touchy, I realised there was a BRT system in Almere really very early on, and there was a BRT system in London, in Cheshire, in Britain early on, but these were designed in new towns or expanding towns. They were designed along with the new city. What was new about Curitiba in the south of Brazil was this was an existing large-ish city, and they placed a new system of transport onto an existing city. So that's what's good about it. You can see here you have specially built stations where you get onto the buses. You have segregated lanes. You have modern buses as opposed to the battery buses that are so traditional in Latin American cities. And these, after starting with single bus, you then got an articulated bus, and you now get bi-articulated buses, like 3 buses. It's beginning to look like a train. It hasn't quite got those dimensions, but this is what's and the systems are quite widespread, and this is in major opposition to solutions such as the metro. And it is advantageous this because it's so much cheaper to build, and it also you actually get a network, because most metro systems start with one line, and most metro systems in the world, when there's only 1 or 2 lines, they're only covering 5 or 10 of journeys. Whereas these systems cover a much higher proportion of passenger journeys. Curitiba suddenly became the exemplar for urban planning in the third world at least. And the BRT system was copied to one degree or another in in Quito, Porto Alegre, Sao Paulo, and particularly Bogotá, which I'll talk about in a moment. And as a sign of its prestige, although there ought to be many of these wonderful prizes given out these days, the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements in 1996 claimed Curitiba was the most innovative city in the world. Medellin got it last year, Mexico City has got it this year. This is part of public relations campaigns of cities to get status and therefore compete with other third world cities for foreign investment. So I don't believe them. Transmillennial began in 2000 in Bogotá. You can see the similarities with the Curitiba system. There are similarities and differences. What's distinctive about Bogotá was that it spread much more widely, at least initially. It was probably had heavy engineering, which I'm not sure I agree with. It was an instant success with the population, and the people who built the system immediately became global superstars traveling the world to sell Transmillennial to other parts of the world. And you can see that today it has spread over a large part of Bogotá, although in recent years they have not built some of the extensions that they should have done. They're now actually talking about building a metro in Bogotá, but they've been talking about that for 60 years, fortunately with no success so far, but we'll have to see about that. But you can see it's a widespread system, all with double track systems, now with 3 bi-ticketed buses, and it carries a larger, I've got the figures in a moment, it carries an awful lot of passengers. Transmillennial became famous, was awarded all sorts of accolades in different places in Stockholm. It was visited by transport authorities from masses of countries, and people like Gilbert also was the head of the system and was rightly proud of his ability to create this system out of chaos, travel the world, selling Transmillennial to anybody who would listen. It also became very popular with the World Bank, certain parts of the World Bank, and BLT systems have now been initiated in 180 cities, mostly that are very increasing in China, North America, and South Africa. This is rapid transfer. In 1975, there were only 19 BLT systems in the world, many fewer than metros, and 27 in 1980, way below the number of metros. And here are some figures. You can see Latin America. Sorry, I've messed up somehow the formatting here. But you can see that they're carrying in Latin America something like 20 million passengers a day, which is really quite impressive. And China is still expanding, but very soon it will have overtaken Latin America because of the sheer numbers of the Chinese population. So in terms of length, most of the length is in Latin America, over 1/3. But what's interesting is that North America has now got 20% of the network length, still only 3% of the passengers, but this is an innovation that has actually spread to North America, so that's why it's included here in my talk. Moving on to another example, Chile, capital housing subsidy programs. For years, housing policy in poor countries followed the experience of developed countries. As we know, or at least in Britain, public policy in housing has been a bit of a shambles. We built public housing estates for the poor, which deteriorated into slums. We didn't maintain them. There was no community participation. We started knocking them down. The United States was similar. I think Dutch experience is a bit better. French experience is very similar to that of Britain. And they gradually became ghettos of poverty and of immigrants. And it was not successful. It was not successful in countries that had developed this expertise. It was even less successful in poor countries, which tried to replicate these programs. And of course, there were so many more poor people in the south, and so fewer and many fewer resources that there wasn't a hope in hell of building public housing for the poor. And as soon as they built public housing, it tended to go either to the middle classes or to party members of the political party who got access to the public housing. This was a bit of a disaster. So, what to do? Well, the Chilean housing model is very interesting. After the 1973 military coup that overthrew Salvador Allende, the socialist president, you got an extremely right-wing regime in Chile, which, after a year, was dominated by Augusto Pinochet. Along with the military coup came a new way of thinking, new at least Chile, which was founded on neoliberal thinking straight from the University of Chicago economics faculty. For some years, students from the Catholic University in Santiago had been going to the economics faculty on Milton Friedman and his friends in Chicago and imbibing what was to become orthodoxy in Britain, the United States, among economists and among governments when Reagan, Thatcher, the Japanese all adopted neoliberal policies. But in Chile, this hit in 1974, well before Margaret Thatcher in 1979, Reagan in 1980. And the whole system was turned over to right-wing neoliberal economic thinking. And every ministry was told, we want a new policy in line with neoliberal economic thinking. So people in the Ministry of Housing in Chile sat down, and I've talked to the three people who designed the system, and they said, these were our guidelines, and we fitted the policy to as closely to match what would be approved by the planning authorities of the government. And this was to give up designing public housing and to hand over to the private sector responsibility for building housing for the poor. But of course that wouldn't work because there were too many poor people in Chile, which is relatively prosperous by Latin American standards. So what they decided was they would give subsidies. It is an honour the right-wing government in Chile insisted on giving subsidies for housing to the poor. And the only explanation I've been given for this is that we've got this long tradition of subsidising housing for the poor in Chile, therefore we couldn't change it. But one of the very few things that wasn't changed. So that's an irony. And Pinochet himself had a little account which he could lean on, and when he was struggling for later on when he tried to become legitimate and become a Democrat, he was using this fund to build these housing projects in order to elicit support. So you have subsidies for demand. This is what the beneficiaries would use their subsidy in order to go to a private developer and say, I want one of houses. And they would go to the bank and get a mortgage, and you suddenly converted poor people into middle-class consumers. That was the intention. But there was also an intention to, you only gave subsidies to the so-called deserving poor. The deserving poor were those who could demonstrate that they were willing to help themselves. Not by taking land, but by putting money into a bank account and saving over a year or 18 months. And then they could go to the authorities and say, look, I've been saving this money for 18 months, fine, we will visit your house to see how many television sets you've got and how many cars. If you're poor by our criteria, with this savings, we'll give you money because you deserve it. And then they go to the bank and get a mortgage. This was the system. And the broad intention was that it would cut back on government intervention, because the government was only involved in allocating subsidies. Right. There's a picture of one sort of housing. I really discussed this. Chile's housing policy was innovative, but within a neoliberal straitjacket. Why did the Chilean system spread? First and foremost, it seemed in Chile. Unlike every other Latin American country, the Chileans were actually cutting our housing deficit. You can argue whether housing deficits mean very much, but Chile was making progress in reducing the number of people living either flimsy accommodation or with no home at all. Model fitted rules of neoliberal restructuring, and therefore was popular with the World Bank, Eastern Development Bank, in the times of Thatcher, Reagan, and so on. The World Bank and the Eastern Development Bank began sending Chilean officials all over Latin America to sell the Chilean model. The World Bank tried selling this to South Africa. They didn't want to hear it, but they tried nonetheless. And the Chileans came back despondent because, oh dear, Bolivia isn't like Chile, Ecuador isn't like Chile. They hadn't reformed their whole system, which was needed in order to implement the. But Chile had become a status net. Its economy was booming, they were reducing poverty, if not inequality, and gradually it became pratic, and therefore Chile was a status nation, which always helps transfer of information. And in Latin America, it also had the advantage, with the exception of Brazil, insofar as everybody spoke Spanish, and you can communicate relatively easily. So eventually, Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama adopted subsidy models highly influenced by Chilean experience. And there was also considerable interest in others. And by 1993, Chilean housing subsidy model had become best practice with the World Bank. Interworking. Oops. I can't go backwards. Conclusions. Innovations in the South have rarely been totally original. Most of them have some intellectual debt to thinking of the North. This is particularly the case in Chile. It is a hybrid model. They developed the housing model independently, but the rules were laid down by the Faculty of Economics in Chicago. BRT had some precedents in Monaco and Liège, but it was essentially a new system. It was installed in new cities. Sorry, I meant to say it was installed in old cities as opposed to new cities. And of course, many of the southern innovators had north links. The planners of Brasilia had seen France for 7 years. There's almost no example of innovators with some experience in university education or planning experience in the north. Why these innovations began to appear? Well, first of all, they tend to be cheaper. Metro systems, for example, are extraordinarily expensive and tend only to afford to build 1 or 2 lines, whereas port cities of now 20, 25 million people need a lot more than 1 or 2 lines. So BRT systems are relevant. The innovation of BRT systems or capital housing subsidy programs are relatively simple. It's not as complicated as building a metro system, and therefore that has an appeal in, say, South Africa or in China, or even some parts of the United States. They were fostered through Washington by the multinational development. So they got a helping hand. And transferring knowledge has become increasingly easy over the years. Cheap flights. People can travel around much more quickly and learn where they should travel on the cheaper, faster flights. And people from third world cities are spreading the word by visiting overseas. So there's all sorts of ways in which innovation is under encouraged. Have the southern innovations made any real difference? Well, as I've already said, Chile had difficulty convincing ministry officials in other parts of Latin America the benefits of the system. And as one Chilean authority said to me, well, every time I go to Bolivia, they change their housing minister. What can we expect to do? I have to start from scratch every time I go. That was part of the problem. And there was a wonderful discussion I had in USAID, who had funded in Andreas Soto with huge sums of money. And one official said, I was absolutely desperate. My colleagues were giving me this money. I actually cancelled one of these programs. So there were doubts about some of these allegations. Curitiba is less than perfect. Its system actually doesn't spread beyond the municipality of Curitiba. But there are lots of, a large proportion of the metropolitan area is outside and therefore doesn't benefit from the BRT system. And currently, Curitiba wants to build a metro. It may or may not be correct at this stage to build a metro, but it's a sign BRT is not providing sufficient capacity. In Bogota, Bogota is the one neighborhood where BRT systems are hugely unpopular. This is hugely unfair. You can see from these figures. Satisfaction in Transmilenio in 2008 was 49%. In 2001, it had been about 90%. And now it's down to 15%. Why? Well, because Bogotaners don't like crowding onto crowded buses. It's been a huge success. But the consequence of the success is astounding as we do on the London Underground like this, and Bogotaners don't like it, particularly as the thieves get onto the buses and steal their cell phones on the buses. So it's not going to, I still think that Transmilenio is a huge success, but Bogotaners don't think so. And BRT transfer to Chile, at least initially, was a complete disaster. Basically because the Chileans mucked it up. They didn't do it properly. At first sight, it overloaded at times the metro system. It was just bad. And the capital housing subsidy programs in Chile, they complained that it's creating ghettos of poor people, just like the old public housing subsidy programs did. It creates isolated communities in South Africa, new estates for the poor on miles from centres of employment. There's the deterioration of the housing stock because you pack very poor people into housing estates. They don't have any money to maintain the housing. And in Colombia, they cheat on mayors saying, oh, these are poor people, and they're not necessarily poor. Builders, these are the programs and so on. So all sorts of problems. Nevertheless, I think this is my final. The spread of ideas in the South has to be a positive development because it's more likely to replicate experience from broadly similar countries. If you take something from New York or Los Angeles and try and implant it in Brazzaville, it seems to me it's bound to be a disaster. It's quite possibly if you transfer Curitiba to Brazzaville, it may also be a disaster, but it's less likely to be a disaster. And certainly if you imitate conditions in South African cities are much more likely to learn sensibly from Brazil than they are from Britain or the Netherlands. And if BRT systems and capital housing subsidies haven't been a total success, I would argue that they've been much more successful than any alternative metro systems. And so the example I would argue is worth studying. I hope that South will develop more policies of its own, and I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about a topic that, about my background. I mean, yes, I studied architecture and planning, and I was with the first 20, 25 years, I was known as a planning theorist, and then studied Dutch planning, and for the last 20 years, I have focused on European spatial planning, which is not a fantastic success story, but which still fascinates me. It taught me a lot about European integration as such. So increasingly my interest is shifting towards European integration and the role of space and corrugated, and also the role of policy transfer. So that's the Europeanization machine and the role of policy transfer. Because I do think that policy transfer is one of the engines of Europeanization, underestimated. First of all, talk about Europeanization as such, the concept, and then secondly, I'll say that's probably the main part of the paper. I'll say something about the transfer in planning. I'll give you some evidence and my thoughts about what has been happening, mainly then in spatial planning, not when we're speaking, because that's the empirical base that I have. And then I'm going to look back at the concept of Europeanization and look at European integration theory, because there's a lot of confusion amongst experts and certainly amongst the public about what European integration actually is. I mean, the most common idea is the negative one. It's the Brits call it, it's of course federalization of the federal state. It's a threat to the nation state. And that's what European integration is perceived to be. And it is, yes, but then the question is it worth to sustain the nation state in its traditional form? And yes, there will be conclusions. So, you know what you can expect a lot of reflection on spatial planning practice and also thoughts on European integration. Europeanization, my source of inspiration has been a paper by Clark and Jones from 2008, and there are several papers. And there they talk about Europeanization as a frame of reference in the experience of Europeans in virtually any field touching European identities, now mediated through European integration. There is a process going on of Europeanization, and as I will demonstrate to you using examples from planning, this process has been for more than 100 years, and European integration, which means, of course, the establishment of the European Union and its predecessors, has been an extra stimulus. It's not anything. And this Europeanization derives from exchanges of historically and territorially contingent knowledge. So one nation, one professional community, ideas which then are transmitted through various channels to others. And this European integration harnesses this potential, but it's not the same. So let's. This should go down. No, it doesn't. Oh yeah. Now I want to briefly discuss this concept of Europeanization further. First of all, based on what Clark and Jones have said and what I've explained, it's important to say what Europeanization is not. Well, it's not only Europe. I've played this. It's here in the text, of course, than it is in global presentation. But there's Europe, which is all about the EU, of course, and but Europeanization is not the same. The two are related, but not. It's not a one-way street. Yes? It's not only a one-way street in two respects. It's not only the EU in the driving seat, and it's not quite clear whether Europeanization, this ongoing process, will necessarily result in a strengthening of the EU. So it is census. It's not a one-way street. And it's not the same as standardization. I mean, that's a big, big thing in the anti-EU that it's all about standardization. Not the same thing. What is it? Well, Europeanization is a great learning process of experimentation, stretching well beyond the borders of the EU. And it's an open-ended process. It's an open-ended process of policy transfer. The outcomes are by no means certain. It's always exciting. But at the same time, Europeanization is a necessity because we do no longer live in containers. If we ever have, but we certainly don't anymore. And yet, the big of the EU as a community of member states, which is symbolized by this man, this big constellation, does suggest that the EU is built up of several containers. By the way, if there are any Croats in the room, apology, Croatia is not yet on this one. I didn't find a proper map. Now I'm thinking about planning, transfer and planning, and here my architectural and urban design background shows the planning is full of planning concepts which have been international. This is the original diagram by Ebenezer Howard, 1902, I don't remember which of the two was the source, but since then, think in terms of and propagate the idea of new towns. And we have examples of that from the European South. Another one that is perhaps less well known is Vienna as a source of innovation. I studied there as well. And it has a green belt, a legally instituted green belt, well protected by planning law since 1905. And I have seen in my youth, I've seen a building that has gone up, illegally clandestine building, a villa actually, within the green belt being pulled down. So it's a strong protection. And green belt, of course, is an idea that is around the world. It's London is a prominent example. The neighborhood concept is similar. The idea of survey before plan, again, it's an idea that is common knowledge. Regional planning. The example of the New Deal and the Tennessee Valley Authority has been watched, not necessarily the world, but certainly amongst the planning community. I know that the French were very fascinated. Some French aménageurs were very interested in it. And this is a book written by a Dutch planning pioneer, Joël de Cassers, unfortunately largely forgotten even in the Netherlands. But he wrote this book in 1936. He had been traveling to the United States. And one of the topics which he wrote about is the New Deal and the Tennessee Valley Authority. And he actually, because he was a provincial advisor in the South, he actually drew up regional plans, taking into account even plans of neighboring provinces and of Germany, because his province was close to Germany. And international conferences were already a vehicle and an opportunity for all this. Raymond Ungreen went to the exhibition in Berlin in 1910, taking some of the exhibits to London, mounting the city planning exhibition in London. The world exhibitions were also very often vehicles for international exchanges. It was far less frequent than now. And the conference of the International Federation of Housing and Planning was called at the time, 1924, had a very important role to play in the development. And as a result of that, and especially the Second World War, a nascent transnational planning community emerged in Europe, based on the Netherlands, I should say. So, you know, Dutch citizen house, I should hang out the Dutch flag. And they started to lobby for European planning, for the European community to take on a role in urban and regional planning. And this was the Conference of Regions in Northwest Europe, chaired by the then National Director of the Netherlands, with people from, and I was myself have joined, he has published on this. This included countries of Northwest Europe, including also the UK, especially the Southeast. And they were beginning to form their new mental maps of Europe. This map simply shows population density in Europe, in the wider Europe, nothing with the EEC. Immediately you see a configuration which is remarkably like this one, which is the blue banana, which in the one was not blue, but that's a different story. But there was an appreciation that it's a core area in Europe of which the Netherlands is part, and maybe we should make provisions, we should plan this because there are interconnections. And this conference also looked into a major infrastructure project that began to appear on the horizon, the Channel Tunnel. What would the impact be of the Channel Tunnel? And a German regional planner, Norbert Ley, was invited, was chairing the working group that made a plan, a sketch like this one of what the impact could be, and of course there was a report. And this all resulted in the first statutory transnational plan ever. I think it was 1983 or maybe 1986 that this was adopted for the Benelux. The Benelux is a microcosm of the EU. And I'm not saying this was a glaring success. I mean, certainly not. But and this is a story that repeats itself about European planning. But it was an interesting project. And it contributed to the formation of this nascent planning community. And the Council of Europe played a role in this. And largely forgotten now, but it was the only game in town, because the Council of Europe set up a Conference of Planning Ministers, which has a French acronym, CEMAT, and they produced a report, Regional Planning in European Program, 1968. And difficult to apply, but it formulates a European planning program. And this European planning program is being, or has had a major influence on the thinking. And eventually the ministers agreed, and the Council of Europe agreed formally to the Luminous Charter, which amounted to a European planning program. What did it suggest? Well, balanced socio-economic development. For those of you who know the ESDP and others, these years were repeatedly found. Quality of life is an issue, responsible management of nature and environment, rational use of land, and vertical and horizontal coordination. Now, this had a lot of influence on the thinking of the European planning community, and it also began to percolate through to the EU. The EU, it was the European Community at that time. The European Community consistently refused to get involved. Why? Because there's no competence for planning in the European Union. But the European Parliament thought differently. So the European Parliament passed a resolution that regional planning, European regional planning policy, should include an element of planning. To explain this, I should say very briefly that regional planning, which was actually set up, as Altman Petzold reminded us only a couple of days ago on Yammer, it was set up exactly 40 years ago. So it's a policy that has existed for 40 years. But for the first 15 years, it was certainly not a regional policy. It was simply a matter of financial transfers from the community coffers back to the member states. So somebody by the name of Jean-François Drevet has written a book about regional policy in French. He said that this regional policy was neither regional nor communitarian. But the European Parliament passed this resolution inviting the Commission to pursue aménagement du territoire. I use the term French on purpose because the influence was French aménagement du territoire. At that time, already engaged in French national regional planning. And also the rapporteur was a French speaker. It wasn't French, but it was some from the Belgian. And the Parliament demanded that the various community policies should be coordinated as regards space and their spatial effects. And lo and behold, emulated the program of the Council of Europe, balanced and integrated development, preserved European heritage, and they were asking for a commissioner for regional planning. Not regional policy, regional planning. But they didn't get very far, but very shortly thereafter, the law came. The law instituted cohesion policy, as we know now, more or less, and planners jumped on this. And the planners really saw an opportunity here to project spatial planning to the heart of EU. Why? Because cohesion policy, of course, inherently is spatial policy. And you know the mechanisms, they are based on statistical data, but the planners wanted to have a genuine spatial strategy, and they wanted to knock sense into cohesion policy based on a spatial issue or spatial strategy. Now, this resulted in the initiative to produce the European Spatial Development Perspective, which has been my topic of research for a long time, which didn't succeed. It didn't succeed in becoming a strategic document for cohesion policy, not because the EU didn't want this, but because the member states didn't want it. I mean, here the idea of what you is and what the relation of Europe and the member states is or should be came in. The member states insisted, continued to insist. There's no clause in the treaty saying that the EU may engage in spatial planning, so you are not allowed to do that. It's a convoluted story which I'm not going to touch upon now, but if you challenge me, I can for several days. But in the end, it became what's called an intergovernmental document. The member states, between them, deciding on the content, graciously accepted provisions of the document was actually printed in the printing press of the European Union. But it was ineffectual. Ineffectual because of this situation. But this doesn't mean to say that it didn't have an effect in a different sense. Yes. And here I'm quoting Adams, Notella, and News. The legacy, it can be argued that the learning not generated have been more important than the European documents themselves. This reinforces a sense of European spatial planning as an arena of learning. There you have the transfers. There your own role and your own topic comes back again. And that is what I have been arguing for quite some time now. The European spatial planning has been, I call it, the learning machine. And this has taken on massive proportions. There has been a lot of research on this as well. Kai Böhme, who is now running Spatial Insight, he did his PhD on the effects in the Scandinavian countries, I should rather say Nordic countries, difference there, and Southern Europe. Gilbert, and I, we have done a special issue on it in Southern Europe, and rather than repeating all the that we have found there, I give you one example. On my travels through Europe, I came to Spain, actually Valencia, and spoke to colleagues and showed me this document, which is the spatial strategy for the autonomous community of Navarre. And put the document in the don't speak Spanish. Why? Because it was virtually a carbon copy ESDP. So all the ideas of the ESDP, including the diagrams, being applied to the community of Navarre. There has been some systematic research on the effects of the ESDP, financed by ESPON on Project 231 in 2007, and it confirmed that there has been a vague, diffuse, but noticeable learning effect, amongst other things, a collaborative style of planning and the idea of polycentric development. And Internet, of course. It's a major learning, tens of thousands of experts throughout Europe, well, staggering if you dot up the sums. And here I'm showing you just one map out of a report produced by the Mission Opérationnelle Transfrontalière in France, taking cross-border and transnational planning extremely seriously, at least my good friend Jean-Nicolas, who is Director General of MOP. But there's genuine support from the regions, not always from Paris itself. And you see the intensity of exchange in one corner of your which includes Switzerland. Switzerland, Norway participating like hell in these processes because they see the benefit. And Geneva, I mean, if you know the situation of Geneva, highly dependent on the workforce coming from all over the world, but also in particular from the Haute-Savoie, which is right next to Geneva, which sort of closed down. I wonder what they are going to do if they issue the new referendum, but that's a different issue. And then of course the macro-regional strategies, which I think are a great promise, of which there are 4 have been agreed now, and there are more being discussed. And what they exactly are is a topic in itself, and it is attracting a lot of academic research now, what they actually are. But one thing I would like to say, because it's relevant to my reflections later on, the diagram itself suggests that these are kind of super nation states, collections of, because they have a border, but they are not. These are just the core areas of the macro-regional strategies, and they are not definitive borders, and they are not state-like institutions at all. What they are is a different matter. Now, let me now talk about integration theory. Let me talk about what this all means within integration. Now, integration theory, or integration itself, may be at a dead end. So, I mean, we are in a multiple crisis at the moment, and a lot of discussion about what this means, and there's discussion about Brexit, and I see all sorts of, this is not my privileged knowledge, but I see all sorts of very difficult situations arising. We don't know what's going to take. And the reason for this is that we haven't sorted out the integration theory. Basically, there have been from the beginning 2 major theories about theories, ideologies, whatever. One was the idea of the United States of Europe. That was the origin, and it's the EU supranational institution. The belligerent nation states, pacifying especially the German-French border. There's a wonderful book written by on the deconstruction of the French-German border and the whole history of the EU around this major conflict. And the other one is, hey, it's not. I mean, it's member states voluntarily in intergovernmental treaties giving up some of their competence to the EU and keeping a very close eye on these competences and being involved in the addition of these competences. And the whole stories, research about this. But in integration theory generally, yes, the conflict to the interpretation of what EU means has come to a dead end. And in its stead, there are some other theories now, have been for the past 20 years. Multi-level governments, the recognition that cohesion policy, because it was a cohesion policy, or what was a regional policy at that time, that it's really different. It cannot be explained either as an intergovernmental exercise or as a supranational, but it's much more a question of people do things together. It took an American to formulate this idea. The idea was formulated by Jerry Marx, who previously, I'm told, has done research into corporatism, and who came from America and looked at this and was flabbergasted, and then it said, well, look, this is something else from what you think it is. The open method of coordination, too complicated to explain, but quite some time, it's considered to be one of the alternative theories. Rather than legislating and forcing member states to do certain things, which very often is inefficient and cost an awful lot of political capital, let's engage in some kind of joint coordination with mechanisms and so on. The whole Lisbon strategy was built on that. Yes. And some other authors, again in American actually, two Americans, Sable and Zeitlin. Zeitlin is now a professor in Amsterdam, saying, look, what is actually happening here is that we are engaging in what they call democratic experiments. And it's all driven by policy transfer. So I come to my conclusions. Policy transfer is the engine of Europeanization. At the beginning, I was trying to demonstrate that this is actually so. And so those of you who are doing research on policy transfer, and those of you who are engaged in policy transfer, you are sort of important figures in this. The organization in planning itself, which was the main part of the presentation, the competency which has been so much talked about in European spatial planning and continues to be talked about now, and we are talking in terms of territorial cohesion, it's a diversion. I mean, it's based on this idea of a dichotomy between intergovernmental Europe and the national Europe. And that controversy itself is it starts with the wrong premises. Anyway, we're not going to sort that out. The second conclusion that I have is that planning cum learning works. I mean, you are evidence of that. And this has taken on fantastic proportions in my lifetime, the last 20 years that I've looked at this. And in that respect, I think that European spatial planning is a mirror of the EU. It gives some indications of where the EU might be going. Clearly, the state building has stalled. Yes. I mean, except for Guy Verhofstadt and David Cohen-Bouchy, nobody believes in federalism. I mean, very few. Oh yes, I'm a card-carrying member of the European Federalist Party. It's a plan. And I don't see this as a future. I don't think, not only because member states do not agree, because the concept of the nation state is out there. Why should we have a large nation state, a federal nation state, and not so that the nation state will disappear, but as a perspective, it is out there. Yes. The transfer machine is ticking over, also in European integration generally. That is the flesh and bone, actually. And where it will end, I don't know. I mean, nobody knows. The future is inherently uncertain, especially in European integration. Yes. And here I draw on Richardson, who is a political scientist, British political scientist, looking at it. And he very usefully in his chapter makes a distinction between seismic events and atomic movements. Now, seismic events, well, Brexit, whatever. But also, you don't know. I mean, we didn't know. We hardly even knew the word tsunami before it happened. So anything can happen, and it will have, could have a major impact, to the better or to the worse. The only way in which we can possibly handle seismic, if at all, is through scenarios, very inventive thinking about catastrophes and about positive. But there are also these tectonic movements. Tectonic movements are slow, but they change things. They divide continents. That was a tectonic movement. I think that the learning, the transfer that we are talking about here is a tectonic movement. It's hardly conceivable that it should become less. And maybe it's becoming difficult, maybe the finance is becoming more difficult, but we are not going to unlearn something in English. That's again a tectonic movement. Yes. Think about all these little things, or cheap air flights, like you mentioned. So there is a glimmer of hope here. We represent